Welcome back, one and all, to this study, the continuing study of Ecclesiastes. We're going to look right now at chapter 7, where Solomon provides us with some more contrasting proverbs. These gems of wisdom will serve us well when we apply them to the case that Solomon has been making through the first 6 chapters so far. We are in this world under the sun that God has created and continues to orchestrate and remains sovereign over. We are surrounded by a multitude of vanities that can sweep us away, that can improperly occupy our time, turn our attentions away from where it ought to be. It can make us bitter, it can make us resentful, and the like. So, here are some practical truths that we can arm ourselves with against those vanities that can plague us, and, maybe more importantly, can potentially injure our Christian walk. And furthermore, as Solomon just showed us that prosperity and wealth are not necessarily good things, these proverbs can also serve to remind us that adversity and affliction are not necessarily bad things. So, Ecclesiastes chapter 7, I'm just going to go through them kind of one or two or little sections at a time. Start with verse 1. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. Okay, so there was a time when a name used to mean something. I'm not sure if it's as prevalent today as perhaps it used to be, or perhaps it should be. I hold that having a good reputation, a good family name, is still a valuable thing. It's a testament to the character of the patriarch of the family, and it carries a weight. It carries a gravitas to the rest of the family. If a man is a Christian man of his word, if his yes is yes and his no is no, if he's reliable and if he's trustworthy, then his good name will precede him wherever he goes. And that is better and more valuable than any external ornament that a man could buy to try to amplify his life. The wise man guards his reputation closely and doesn't put himself into positions where his character could be called into question. The second part of this, the day of death for the Christian is better than his day of birth. Okay, to live is Christ and to die is gain, right? The birth of a child marks the beginning of that child's life of vanities under the sun. And while we undoubtedly and rightly celebrate the newness of life and the potential that comes with it, we need to remember that the death of the believer is a gateway to an eternity in God's presence. And this is a favorable condition. Verses 2 through 6 can be grouped together, which reads, "It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity." So to start breaking this down, we need to set a context of expectation and go back to chapter 2. So if you remember, one of the first things that Solomon tested were mirth and laughter and feasting and music. And what were the results? He found them to be empty and filled with vanity. So as we look at this section of chapter 7, we need to keep in mind that he's referring to the empty laughter of fools, the vain feasting, the mindless preoccupation with music and entertainment, and not the joyous actions of the wise. His overall point here is that seriousness is far better than the frivolous and time-wasting busyness of the human condition that we can be so predisposed to. Our sin nature so easily and readily wants to overindulge in food, in drink, in merriment, in entertainment, in distractions, that it would be better for us to attend a funeral and remind ourselves of the shortness of time that we have here under the sun. We can learn more from opportunities that cause us to reflect on our place in eternity than we can from being immersed in the empty vanities of life. Now, there are extremes here. As is the case with a lot of other things in life. You can have the dour, perpetually serious, stern, and unloving one, on one end of the spectrum. And, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got, a head in the clouds, kind of airheadedness. Everything is fun and merry. And on the other end, right? Both the funeral and the feast are lawful for us to participate in. We are allowed to dance. Okay, we are allowed to imbibe if our conscience permits. Remember that the Apostle Paul said, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. We're not to be dominated by our flesh, so this does require wisdom and prudence and discernment. Okay? The scriptural rebuke of a wise elder can do wonders for our countenance and spiritual growth if it's given in grace and if it's accepted with humility. Okay, Proverbs 6:23 says, "For the commandment is a lamp and the teaching a light, and the reproofs of discipline are the way of life." Okay, the way of life. It's a lesson that has a lasting impact. You contrast that to the laughter and song of fools, which Solomon compares to the crackling of thorns under a pot. Okay, if you've ever burned thorns in a fire, what happens? They flare up quickly with a lot of immediate heat, but it doesn't last. Okay, try to heat a pot of water to boiling point with thorns. All right, it's an exercise in futility. It'll take way too much fuel to make an impact versus the slow and steady burn of a good hardwood, right? Likewise, verses 7 through 10 can be grouped together as well, where it says, "Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this." Okay, these verses deal with the importance of the wise man maintaining a calmness of spirit and not giving in to anger or brash attitudes. Okay, you ever live with someone or maybe work with someone who doesn't have a calm spirit? Every problem, big or small, is taken personally and they freak out over it. Okay, it's a never-ending roller coaster of emotion. Solomon spoke previously of the oppression of the poor by the powerful. Okay, here he's reminding us that if we are to be wise, we're to understand the fate of the cruel and the corrupt and allow that to keep our temper in check. Verse 8 deals with that brashness of spirit that comes with starting something new but not understanding the long road that the activity might require. I have a close relative who's a non-believer, and he is typified in this verse because he's always starting something new, but he's never finishing a single thing. Every new job, every new apartment, new whatever the new this. He ballyhoos about it on social media with a lot of attention-seeking fanfare, but it never lasts. 3 days into the new job, and he's already got problems with half the people there. 6 weeks later, guess what? He's been fired, and now he's on to the next new thing. There's no stability there. There's no building of a life, no long-suffering temperament, none of the, keeping the end goal in mind that gives the wise man that head-down grimace of determination. Well, we see this a lot in politics, don't we? You have intentions. It's all about the intention, right? The intention is applauded with much fanfare and ribbon cutting and bill signing and clappiness, rather than the actual result of the program. Okay, some new bill that's, for sure, we really, really mean it this time, for real. We're going to end homelessness with this bill. Yeah, okay. 60 years and trillions of dollars later, the war on drugs still goes on, as does the war on poverty, or the war on terror, or the war on climate change. You fill in the blank with whatever. None of them have a tangible exit strategy in sight, partly because they're not designed to. But aren't they just so proud of themselves in their intentions? Verse number 9, being quick to anger is the hallmark of the foolish. And we can so easily excuse it. And not only that, but we kind of we can expect others to do the same. Good old Fred, he's just got a short fuse like that. He just speaks his mind, or they bring their race into it. Oh, yeah, you know how Italians are. Or, I'm Puerto Rican. And it's in my blood. It just makes me overly passionate. I'm sorry, that's not likely the case. What it does, it makes the individual an unrighteous fool. Okay? James tells us in chapter 1, verse 19, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. I've been told before that I tend to drift to the side of being an angry person. I fully cop to this. I confess this. I confess this to you 100%. I can be a very angry person. I am keenly aware of this sin in my life. And consequently, this particular passage just punches me right in the face. And if verse 9 to me is a punch to the face, then verse 10 is just, I get absolutely wrecked by. Okay? It says, say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Okay? I am a creature given over to great and terrible fits of nostalgia. Think back to the golden age of my childhood. The early to mid 80s, the toys, the music, the movies, just the simplicity of life, riding your bikes, being outside all day till the streetlights came on. There was a slower pace of life to that time frame before technology came along and just rides us all like a racehorse, whipping us all along at this breakneck pace that we can so very easily find ourselves in now. I get mournful over it at times. It's easy to say. It's so easy to say the 80s and 90s, they were a better time to be a kid or a teenager, young adult, whatever. But I would hazard a guess that every generation can postulate the same theory. Okay? So for every Gen Xer that dives into a visit of melancholy and plays some Depeche Mode on vinyl while watching the original Ghostbusters and picks up a classic G.I. Joe action figure from 1983. For every one of those, there's probably also a millennial or a boomer or a member of the silent generation who does the same for the timeline that they lived in, which they think was the best before everything went to hell, right? Or, we can pine for an era that we never even lived in. People can get obsessed with history. And, wouldn't it have been great to have been a knight in medieval England? No, you probably would have been a peasant and died of the plague at the age of 20. What about, oh man, it would have been great to have, captained a big wooden ship during the golden age of piracy. Well, maybe not. Most likely you would have probably gotten rickets and been thrown overboard. Personally, I think I would have been a great detective in, 1940s Los Angeles. That whole vibe, the fedora, the trench coat, the one-room office, she was a pushy dame, but she had a case and she needed my help. That's just not the reality, okay? We need to stop it. God put us in the generation that we're in the timeline that we're in the country, in the family, in the church that we're in for his own purposes. Okay? Much like Esther, we were born for such a time as this, not that. Okay? If we're in a time of local and national or global darkness, we are to be the light. If we're surrounded by dragons, we are to be the dragon slayers. We can lament all we'd like over, why are things so bad now? Or why aren't we in the good old days? All that we'd like. But in the end, those questions are just sinful. Okay? The answer is simply because God doesn't want us to be. If the 80s were the peak of humanity, we'd still be there. Okay, but that's not the case. God, in his providential wisdom, has caused those days to end for his own sovereign purposes, and in the fullness of time has brought us to where we are right now, today, in the here and now. Okay, to rebel against that and to pine for what was, that's not the action of a wise man. The wise man instead embraces the lot that the Lord has given to him in the here and now, accepts where he is presently, for the sole purpose of glorifying God through all of it. Verses 11 through 12. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun, for the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, And the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Okay, so extolling the virtues and benefits of wisdom, in some cases using metaphors of personification, Solomon compares it here to those who are wealthy. Wisdom, like wealth, is gifted to us. It adds to our honor. It allows us to better bless others, and it will remain with us if we manage it rightly. Okay, wisdom contributes to our safety in the same way that a man with, a great amount of wealth can build a, secured, household fortress to protect himself. Wisdom is a shelter to us in times of trial. We can flee to it. We can apply it to the scriptures and use the words of God as a medicine to our souls. The fool knows nothing of these things. They are blind and lost in the wilderness, stumbling from one calamity to the next with no hedge of protection to give them any relief. Verses 13 through 15. Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. In the day of prosperity be joyful, and in the day of adversity consider God has made one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. In my vain life I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in evildoing. So verse 13 is a callback to chapter 1, verse 15, where Solomon stated, "What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted." So the question that was asked back then was why? Why can we not make straight what has been made crooked? And here's the definitive answer: because God has made it crooked for our good and for his glory. Try as we might, rage as we might, we can't hope to bend the crooked path back into shape. We're to be thankful for the good days and the days of adversity because God is sovereign over both of them. He's sovereign over the righteous and he's sovereign over the wicked. He's sovereign over the believing Christian youth who dies in a car accident at the age of 18, and he's sovereign over the Moloch-worshipping octogenarian pedophiles in our government. A lot of contemporary churchianity doesn't like to embrace this. They just want God to be the God of the good things, like delicious meals and beautiful sunrises and puppies and 70-degree days. But when you ask them if this is the same God who ordains earthquakes and tsunamis and famines and global upheavals, they're hard-pressed to give you a straight answer. We don't necessarily like to think about the truth of the darker side of providence, but that doesn't make it any less true. So, applying wisdom and keeping these verses at the forefront of our minds whenever we encounter crooked paths, this will help us to navigate however many twists or turns or dips or outright ditches that the roads our lives may take. Why is this situation such a mess? Well, because God has purposed it to happen this way. Why am I having such a hard time with this? God has purposed it to happen this way. Why am I on the same cycle of depression and anger and frustration? God has purposed it to happen this way. There's a pattern here, folks. We might then ask, why has God purposed it to happen this way? The answer is, again, as his word states, for our good and for his glory. Well, yeah, but for what good? What possibly good could this be to me? We might ask. That's a natural reaction, of course. But the fact of the matter is, we often don't know, especially in the immediate. Maybe, sometimes, we might gain some insight. He might give us some insight. He might give us some wisdom on this months or years later on down the road, but maybe not. Maybe we'll never get to know. And that's okay. If God wants us to know, he'll tell us in one way or another. He'll make it known to us, but he's not obligated. Remember, he is not obligated to explain his reasoning to the likes of us. So to give an example of this, I'll sidetrack here a little bit for a little bit of a story time. So I used to think about this concept a lot, particularly after losing my daughter, who was my son Jake's biological sister, for years. And I mean years, folks. I struggled and wrestled with this concept. How could there be good for me in this big of a loss? It was devastating. It was a devastating loss. What possible good could there be in this? I knew the scriptures, and while I could embrace them intellectually, emotionally, there was no I couldn't jive it with my heart. I knew it in my head, but I couldn't get it to agree with my heart. She died for my good. You sure about that? Because I'm not so sure about that. For years. Okay. The kids would ask a lot of questions over the years, and especially Jake, as he got older, would ask a lot of questions. Not just the whys of what happened, but the wheres and the whys of where he came from, who his biological family was, and how all this came to be. I'd tell him what I knew in age-appropriate contexts, but he always had more questions than I could answer. I just simply didn't know. He had what I believe were like these big empty blocks in himself, these perpetually unanswered questions. Were his biological parents still alive? What about siblings? Why was he born cocaine positive? He one day he hit me with, Dad, why did my birth mom abandon me in the hospital? 9 years old, and he's asking me these types of questions. Buddy, I don't know. But I'm supposed to know, right? Because I'm dad. Right? Legendary superhero dad, right? I'm supposed to have the answers. I'm supposed to know things. Man, I didn't have anything. Years went on like this. And I'm sure that likely that questions without answers can easily put another big empty block into a kid's heart when they're questions that not even your dad knows the answer to, right? Kids look up to their fathers. Dads are supposed to have the answers. I didn't. So then, you fast forward a little bit to 2021, some 13 years later, after I lost my daughter. And God had purposed one of Jake's biological sisters to providentially seek me out. Called me out of the blue, completely out of left field. We talked. They all, and the whole family, all talked to Jake. They ended up coming down to Kentucky for a visit. 11 of them in their family in total. This one big passenger van, a 14-hour drive one way. We met, we ate, we socialized, we visited the gravesite, and it was wonderful. I really don't have the words to do it justice. The result for him, he was able to get a sense of his birth family, where he comes from, biologically. He was able to get questions answered. He was able to have some of those empty blocks filled in. And that's something that I like to believe likely never would have happened if there hadn't been this terrible tragedy 13 years prior that would have led to that moment. I don't know this for sure. This is only speculation on my part. But I began to think that the for my good of that bad situation really wasn't about me at all. It was about my son. But I will say that in the years since that meeting, my perspective on the valleys of life have changed. Okay, God has a purpose for all of it, and at some point there is bound to be a sweetness that follows. And there's a quote by Samuel Rutherford that I really like that applies to this situation. He says, quote, "When I am in the cellar of affliction, I look for the Lord's choicest wines." End quote. God gives the birthdays, and he gives the day of mourning. He gives the storms as well as the sunshine. Isaiah 45:7. He forms light and creates darkness. He makes well-being and creates calamity. You recall, if you've ever read through Job, chapter 2, when his wife, gives him the business after all these horrible things happen to him. She says, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." What's his response to her? "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not also receive evil?" Job was resigned to fully know that God is sovereign, so he let his words be few. I think John Calvin also said it well when he said, "So great and boundless is God's wisdom that he knows right well how to use evil instruments to do good." End quote. We'll look at verses 16 through 22, which says, "Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand, for the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. Wisdom gives strength to the wise man more than 10 rulers who are in a city. Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others. So I want to clarify right off the jump that when he talks about righteousness in this verse 16, this is not the righteousness of Christ that he's referring to. This is not true righteousness. What he's referring to is the man-centered, self-imposed, high piety, hey, everyone, look at how good and righteous I am type of righteousness. You know, the insufferable stickler, conceited in their own wisdom, sanctimonious, and in every conceivable way convinced that they're better than you type of righteousness. The type of righteousness that the Pharisees would have been proud of. You know, they made themselves too wise in their own minds, adding rules to Scripture that weren't there. You know, I don't like to dance, therefore dancing is sinful. And not only is it sinful, but I'm going to petition the local government to put a stop to it. Okay? You only need to watch Footloose to see how that turns out. On the other end of that spectrum, neither are we to be too loosey-goosey with our Christian liberties, thinking ourselves somehow immune to cultural evils and wickedness. It's a very short leap down a very slippery slope once we start making excuses for what we might, and likely might not, be able to handle while watching TV or watching an R-rated Hollywood trash world movie. We do not have the autonomous rule of defining what is good and what is evil. God does. So, when in doubt, see what his word has to say about it, then apply the strength of wisdom to the situation. We hold on to this truth because it's self-destructive to be on the other end of these extremes. If we rightly fear God, if we hold fast to his word, if we adorn ourselves in the full armor that he has provided to us, we will not likely or easily fall into religious foolishness or cultural wickedness. Now, why do we need to hold fast to such a truth? Because as Solomon says, there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Everyone sins. No matter what they may say at the megachurch, no matter how many people might want to sugarcoat it and refer to sin as whoopsie daisies, no matter how much how much the lost might want to argue with you that sin is a man-made construct. No, sin is sin, and it's what God says it is. And everyone sins, lost and saved alike. This is the antidote to any self-righteousness that might try to weaselly worm its way into our hearts. And this is why Solomon follows it up with, by warning us not to be so hyper-vigilant over the sins of others. If you're going to get worked up over someone speaking evil about you or cursing at you, be sure that you've never spoken evil about someone or cursed at someone. Because you can't. Because your heart knows the truth. You know, there's an older saying that, you run into a jerk in the morning, well, you've run into a jerk. But if you run into jerks all day, you might be the jerk. So, also, maybe as another wise man once said, check yourself before you wreck yourself. And as a much, much perfectly wiser man also said, take the plank out of your own eye before you worry about the speck in your brother's eye. Bottom line, cut people some slack, because you're no better. Verse 23, all this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which has been is far off and deep, very deep. Who can find it out? So since the ultimate source of wisdom is located in heaven eternal, far beyond our mortal grasp, we are limited to the wisdom that we can procure here by ourselves under the sun, and rightly so, because we just got done acknowledging the fact that everyone sins. Right? Solomon, despite being gifted by God with a special extra measure, a double portion of wisdom, and the financial ability to seek out and test every single vice known to man, still found wisdom to be far from him the minute he thought he had it. He was still chasing it. Despite having all of these blessings and all of these gifts to be able to accomplish that goal, he was still chasing it. And so this is why the self-righteous attitude is to be so desperately shunned, because we'll never arrive at the place where we know it all and grasp it completely. But there was one thing that he did get a handle on pretty well, and that was his sexual sin. Okay, verses 25 through 29. He says, quote, I turned my heart to know and to search out and to seek wisdom and the scheme of things, and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness that is madness. And I find something more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Behold, this is what I found, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the scheme of things, which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. So this is why I believe that Solomon is writing this towards the end of his life, certainly during his latter years, as his love of the womenfolk proved to be a particular snare for him. You remember reading back from 1 Kings 11 about how Solomon's love for foreign women, what happened? It eventually caused him to turn from the Lord and participate, not just participate, but also sanction. As king, he sanctioned the demonic pagan worship of the foreign nations. Okay, Solomon's proverbs are saturated with warnings, particularly to young men, to avoid the temptress, to avoid the harlot, to avoid the strange women. How there's absolutely nothing good that comes from it. And he ought to know. Okay? Notice he uses language here in Ecclesiastes that's akin to hunting and trapping animals, snares, nets, and fetters. And, like a good hunter, the temptress knows very well how to entrap her prey. Not that it's very difficult. History, both ancient and modern, to the present day, is chock full of examples of men who fall victim to this classic blunder. It is 100% a tale as old as time. Solomon continues his lament here by stating that despite searching for men of integrity, presumably within his own sphere of influence, within his own court, what did he find? He found that one man out of 1,000 was worth anything. So 0.1% of the men that surrounded him and tended to him and served him and advised him, 0.1% were found to have any integrity at all. And in his search amongst the women, likely while reclined on pillows with the lights down low, he found none. Now, shocking that from a pool of politically arranged marriages and wanton concubines he couldn't find a woman of virtue, which is why he extols the virtuous woman so greatly in Proverbs 31. He considers her a rare jewel to be sought after and treasured. He ends this chapter with the statement that while God had made man upright, man continually runs after schemes. While God made us in his image, put eternity in our hearts, and blessed us so abundantly with all manner of creation, we are constantly looking for ways to destroy ourselves. Okay? This applies to the lost, who seek out their own destruction through rebellion against God and their own form of worldly righteousness. And it applies even to the saved, who is at risk of drifting into the aforementioned, pits of self-righteousness and phony piety. They are each dangerous in their own ways. But only the righteousness of Christ can satisfy. It satisfies God the Father, and it satisfies our own souls. So this brings us to the close of Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come back for the next installment. Until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Goodbye.